Very nice to see you all. So thank you for making it, because it's a bit hard, isn't it, this time of the year to sort of get yourself going with training. So I'm one of the directors at Shout, although I do know Joe from Firefly, which I was a journalist, and when I left the BBC to go into PR, it was to set up the broadcast unit at Firefly, many more years than either Joe or myself were going to admit to in this forum. So we do go back a long way. So I came from the BBC's business unit, but I wasn't particularly qualified in business journalism. I started off as a general news reporter, and I've news edited at ITN. I've been a reporter at Sky, worked abroad, doing various journalism jobs in the Middle East and the Far East, but I did start my career in local radio, and that'll be one of the things that we'll be talking about, local radio. And it is funny, because if you're really old like I am, you'll have sort of seen this landscape before. It's really funny how broadcast has evolved and grown and then sort of deconstructed, and so it's quite a time of change for broadcast, and that's really the sort of the point of our course. So I'm hoping I have you for about an hour, but if you need to go before then, or if you feel that you know it all and I'm just teaching you grandmother to suck eggs, then I won't be offended. Feel free to chip in as well, and ask a question or to share your own experiences. I think when it's just such a small group, it can be quite interesting, can't it, particularly when everybody comes from quite diverse backgrounds, just to explain the sort of experiences you've had now. I'm going to assume that all three of you have been doing bits and bobs of broadcast, either yourselves or with an agency like us. Tell me if that's not the case.
Yeah, that's right.
Yes, yeah. So you all start off with some sort of knowledge. Well, I've got a little PowerPoint here, which is really just a prompt for me, which I'll just share my screen with now. Can you see that now?
Yeah.
Yeah. Hold on. Don't remember, I was never the most technical of people. Right, here we go. So I've basically done this as a new course, really to sort of reflect everything that's been going on in the last year. And so what I thought I would do in the next 60 minutes or so is to have a look through regional radio, national television. I haven't accidentally missed off regional television, and I will talk about that a little bit. But we find that regional TV is more difficult, really, and possibly or arguably less rewarding than those other three. And to talk in particular about the impact of COVID. So it's obviously affected all of us, hasn't it, and every business, but it's been quite revolutionary, we think, in terms of logistics for broadcast. And I'm going to be explaining how we've made it work since last March, which was the last time we were in our radio studio, and what we intend to do moving forward. So to sort of take you back to those heady days when we were in a first lockdown rather than a third. And it wasn't impossible, believe it or not, but it was, as you would expect, exceedingly competitive to get any story on air. So, there were those weeks where I'm sure you would have had the same yourself with print and online, where actually nobody could talk about anything other than COVID. But what happens, even when it's a really, really busy news agenda, is after a while, no matter how important the story and the fact that it's gone on for such a long time, you do get story fatigue. So the audiences get story fatigue, and the broadcasters do. Of course, they're going to still cover it, but suddenly there was you get, and I think this sort of came out probably around about end of April, May, where suddenly they were wanting to do other stories, and it was almost needing to remind themselves and the audiences that there was another world, a reminder of the old world. And there was relief, you could tell that with the journalists, when the Black Lives Matter story broke, because finally there was another story that was going to, even if it was only for a couple of bulletins, knock COVID off the top stories. And then of course as we moved further into the year, broadcasters were thinking, okay, they've got to look at not just the headlines, but what's the depth behind the story. And that's when we found that we could do other stories, but they tended to do best when they were COVID related. So for example, we had a client, a fitness client, and suddenly that was a big thing. Broadcasters and journalists couldn't just do Joe Wicks, so we were presenting an alternative, not nearly as well known as he was. But for example, she did really well with that story. And we had another story that was it was something we do every year, and it's to do with potholes. It's actually, it's just going to sound really dull. The Asphalt Alliance. So these are companies that make the tarmac to fill in the potholes and to resurface the roads. And Boris Johnson was in intensive care, and we did this story, and we were sort of humming and hawing. Of course, had we known the state Boris Johnson was going to be in at this point, we would have advised against doing the story. But because you could see COVID was going to go on for so long, you could reach a point where you would never do a PR story. And so we said, it's not going to be as good as it was in previous years, but we probably will be able to do, you know, a decent showing. So anyway, Boris was in intensive care, so obviously that had escalated, and we did manage to hit target. So if it's radio, our target is a minimum of 10 to 12 opportunities on air, and one of those was the Today programme. Today didn't do an interview, but they did do a mention, and they did mention this umbrella organisation. So it does show that even on the busiest of days, it's possible. I'm not saying it's easy, and I'm not saying it was the best coverage ever, but it was possible to get something. And then from sort of the summer, the start of summer, from about June onwards, that's when we really felt that the fatigue for COVID was setting in, and that they were looking for stories that were not even, you know, happy, or they weren't even COVID related. It was just an appetite for other stories. And it was interesting how broadcasters adapted. So, you know, they say that people turn to broadcast when there's a big news story. So you can obviously turn to social and you can get a headline, but you might not rely as much on social. You might not trust them as much. Whereas if you turn to the BBC, you know, something like, I think the figure is 75% of people who get 90% of the population access the BBC, and 75% of them say that they trust the BBC. So why do people go to broadcast having got their news on social? It's because they're wanting to find out more information and the sort of the explanation behind the story. So that's why some broadcasters then increase their news output. But actually some broadcasters and some of the bigger commercial radio stations were amongst them, actually decrease their news. And their reason for decreasing the news was because they felt that people had got fatigued. It was the first talks of how people might get depressed with COVID. And so some broadcasters felt that their job was to provide an alternative, and to be a bit more upbeat, and to entertain people, I suppose, and to distract them from the horror of the news. So it was quite intriguing to see who did that. And you know, it's no surprise, is it really, that BBC did more news and commercials did less. And so, you know, we've got to this stage where we're, you know, 10 months in, aren't we? And, you know, we have sort of got into a rhythm of it all. And I would say it's still competitive to get on air. You know, I don't really remember in all my time as a journalist and all this time in PR, the news agenda ever having been quite as busy as this. But we would say that normal service is more or less there. We personally think it's a slightly more difficult job to do now. But we are really exceeding our targets. And Jono put together this list of campaigns that we've done recently. We probably do more radio than we do TV, but you can see where sometimes it's a mix of both. What those campaigns do share in common on the whole, though, is most of them have got really good spokespeople, because I think if you have a commercial brand and you have a commercial spokesperson, that's even more of a challenge than it used to be. And I think to get a good brand ambassador that's, you know, a household name, or somebody who's a broadcaster, really helps. Sometimes I know it pushes budgets, and not every brand can afford to do that, but if you're a charity and you might have a brand ambassador that works with you, if you're a company and you need to pay for a third party and you don't have the money for it, then sometimes we could do quite well with a psychologist or an academic. Sometimes we even manage to get them to work without a fee. They're doing it for their own self-promotion, even though they're representing a brand. But I think that looks a pretty good list of things. You know, if we'd seen that in 2019, we would have just thought that was a fairly normal outcome. So we're really thrilled to see that at the end of 2020 and the beginning of 21. Long may it continue. So the biggest change I think that COVID's had in broadcast is really logistically. So it's the way we do interviews. So it didn't take long from mid-March really for broadcasters to say they didn't want anybody in the studio. And so over the last sort of 15 years or so, there's been a much bigger move for broadcasters to want to do live interviews rather than pre-recorded and edited interviews. So that's a cheaper way for them to do broadcast. And so as soon as COVID started to become really serious, they were saying, well, we can't have anybody in the studio. And then there was a bit of, well, you can go on location because you can be outside and people don't have to be so close. But it very quickly changed to interviews done over the internet. And I've put there that really it's BBC wants to do FaceTime, which it thinks is broadcast quality. Commercial stations are more about doing an interview over Zoom, and national TV is more, they would do any of those formats, but is arguably more likely to do an interview over Skype. And what's staggering is, because for years and years it was all about quality. So if you'd done a radio day with us before, we'd be saying, well, you've got to tell your spokespeople it's not very good to do an interview via the phone. And it was because the quality, if it crackles or you can't hear somebody so well, the broadcasters aren't interested in that, because that's how audiences really lose interest and move away. But actually, broadcasters we've spoken to, which is particularly national broadcasters, say actually they are going to continue to use remote interviews. And at the moment, that's obviously a really sort of safe way for them to do it. But moving forward, it's a really quick and easy and convenient way for them to set up guests. And national news is, and particularly TV, is such a movable feast. You know, something could be in the running order at the start of the bulletin, and it can be dropped and something else could have come in by the end of the bulletin. We always say with TV, you have to tell your clients it's never a given till it's gone out on air. So in olden times, when they booked a car to bring your person in, we'd say, even if you're in the car on the way to the studio, that's still not an absolute confirmation. So when the schedule is so fluid like that, broadcasters like it, because PR generated stories are normally filler fodder, aren't they, in the bulletin? We're very rarely at the top of the bulletin, a must-have story. We're a kind of nice to have, but as soon as there's breaking news, they could be dropped, and you know, the PR story goes below the line. And I suppose with remote interviews, it's so quick to set them up and then set them down again. That's why they're going to do it. And you know, they're all suffering from cutbacks too, no cost to them. So they like it. And you know, it was pre-pandemic, broadcasters were saying that they were having to make cutbacks, and that was across the board. It was BBC as well as the commercial sector. With COVID, they're cutting it even more, because when there's a big story, that always eats into the budgets more than just a regular news schedule. And then the commercial sector has got this sort of second whammy that when there's a recession or the economy takes a downturn, it's advertising budgets that they go even before PR. So the commercial sector is then struggling sort of doubly. We think there's a silver lining in this, because in our experience, and so this is based on having worked in broadcast ourselves, that if you give stories to journalists in the way they like them, if you make it easy for them, there could be more opportunities there, because you've got the same amount of airtime, you've just got fewer people in terms of producers and journalists and people on the ground trying to fill that airtime. And the second plus is this big boost to audience figures. So as so many of us are working at home, I would, we would always have had the radio or sometimes TV as well on in the office, but I probably watch even more now I'm at home than I would have done before. And that seems to be quite common, because audience figures, as far as we know, and Radar that measures radio is actually stopped at the moment because it can't cope with COVID. But the hearsay and industry say is that audience figures have really gone up as more people work from home, and they're wanting more detail about the news because of so many big stories, and they're looking for that alternative, and even if it's radio on in the background. So to look a bit more in detail with BBC Regional Radio, so this happened really because since COVID. So there used to be 4 programmes in regional radio, and all the content might have varied between one station and the other, but the format was roughly the same. And so what was 4 programmes lasting about 3 hours have now become 3 programmes lasting 4 hours, which is a really long time to put together a programme. And when you think these are small teams of people, maybe a couple of producers and a presenter, maybe the presenter does a bit of setting up beforehand, but that's a lot of airtime when BBC Regional Radio does have bits of music with it, but it has a lot more talk content, so that's a lot of airtime to fill. So you've got the same number of, you've got more hours for each programme, and fewer producers and presenters responsible for filling that time up. So what that's meant in practice is that we used to say, give us a week to sell in for radio. And we used to like a week because BBC Regional Radio would, if they liked a story, would start booking in about a week ahead. And we always like to get national coverage too. And broadcasters like Lists and Nationals have a weekly planning meeting, which tends to happen on a Thursday. And if you can get on that weekly planning meeting, your story is much more likely to be on the 2 days before the story list, the day before the story list, and then critically on the day list of stories which eventually become the broadcast bulletin. But we're now saying, in order to get the best possible coverage, if you're asking for the best possible advice, it's 8 to 9 working days. So in broadcast terms, that's such a long time. But but when you understand the reason why that these producers are running themselves ragged to fill up 4 hours of airtime each day, it becomes a bit more understandable. Of course, we can do it in less, and we do it in less. But if you're trying to get the best possible coverage, if that's what your client or your boss wants, it's sadly the 8 to 9 working days. And, a radio day was always a bit of a, what is it called, a day when it only used to be half a morning. Most PR generated stories for radio and television are much more likely to run earlier in the day than later in the day, when there's organic news breaking and they have much more competition basically. But again, since COVID, we found that the day really has become the day now. So we'll still have a fairly early start, typically from about 8 o'clock, possibly slightly earlier if the story seems quite newsy. If it seems a bit softer, more feature-like, maybe 8:30, 9 o'clock start. But because of that change in schedule, that you've got the lunchtime, the middle programme finishing at 2, you've then got a much longer afternoon show where now they are doing some interviews. So when you're saying to your spokespeople, okay, you need availability, and it probably is going to be all day, we would really advise up until about 5 o'clock now, and then possibly a little bit the day before as well, just to do any pre-records that people like Sky News still like to do a pre-record, embargo the interview and then save it for the breakfast news the next day. So that's really what you've got to say to spokespeople in terms of their availability. So commercial radio, which sometimes takes some getting to grips with because it has changed such a lot. It does look a bit like the industry used to look 20 years ago, really. You've got some very big stations, the Globals and the Hearts, and they're quite difficult, or very difficult really, to get PR stories on them because most of them take their news from Sky. So Sky Radio isn't actually a radio station, in case you didn't know that. It's more like I suppose it's more it's more equivalent to something like press association, that in that it produces content, and sometimes Sky Radio takes content from Sky News, as in the TV news, and it then distributes it to the network of commercial stations who across the country. So it's like the commercial stations are the clients of Sky Radio. So you can't find Sky Radio on a dial anywhere. It's only the commercial stations that pay to get their material from Sky can hear it. But we would say that interviews on Sky Radio, they're very difficult to get the branding from them. And when they do an interview, they're going to cut it down to sort of 15, 20, 25 seconds. So it's not for every client and it's not for every story. Although when you want reach, it's going to, you know, potentially several millions, because it's something like 350, 400 commercial stations are taking the content. So it depends. We always say at the beginning of a campaign, what's going to make you happy? Is it reach? Is it communication of key messages and branding? And then you try to find the stations that are going to answer those needs, really. But if you don't go for the very big commercial radio stations, you've got some very small ones, and they're popping up all the time. I've just read that a second news station is about to open up in Harrogate, for example. So Harrogate, up in the northeast, a small little town, and it's because what used to be called Stray FM has got taken over by Hits Radio, so a big network of stations. They play mainly, well, nearly all music, and there's been a bit of a, I suppose you'd call it a bit of a rebellion, or a bit of a revolution going on, that local listeners have wanted local content. And when that's been taken away because these commercial stations have been sort of absorbed by the bigger chains, really tiny stations have popped up again. And you might think, are they going to be too small? So we used to say that we never sold into stations that had less than a reach of 50,000. But now we're having a bit of a rethink, because some of these stations, they'll give really good interviews. You might get several minutes on air. You'll get lots and lots of branding, but their reach is very small. So we've almost gone back to shall we start offering more interviews? And okay, they'll be made up of smaller audiences, but together, actually the reach will then get bigger, and you'll have had all this airtime. So the world has sort of changed a lot. And I'm just going to pause here because I can't see you, and just to think, were you aware of that change in landscape? What do you think if you ended up with a mix of stations, but some of them would be small? So it's like BBC's fine, but then it's very big stations or very tiny stations. Does anybody want to give me? maybe we're.
Personally, with PayPal, we did a radio day a few months ago, and we secured a range of this kind of coverage. We had stuff in BBC, which, as you mentioned, was pretty brief, and then we had quite a lot of coverage in these smaller consumer radio shows you talk about. And yeah, it was proven, your point is proven in that the quality of these clips were much better, which on the short term, the client was really happy with. But I think we're compiling all these decks and reviews now of last year, and I think what gives value to us is the big figures and the familiar names, mostly for broadcast. But yeah, they were really happy with the smaller regional titles at the time.
We've had some really big brands that have really liked the smaller stations, because sometimes the really big brands, I'm thinking Nescafe is one that always sticks in my mind. It was actually a campaign a long time ago, but I suppose it's what chain of command you have to answer to. So if you've got up your chain of command a boss saying, well, we've got these really important key messages and we want to communicate these key messages, well, actually you can then produce a whole load of audio files where it's been repeated again and again, or almost verbatim what they wanted to see. But that's why we think it's really important to ask at the beginning what's going to make you happy. So we have five choices, and one of them is reach, one of them is communication of key messages, and sometimes people say, oh, well, we want everything, and we say, well, we'll try and get you everything. Of course we'll try and get you everything, and typically a schedule would be to have at least a couple of national interviews in it, so then that does push the reach. Although if it was Sky Radio, probably PayPal wouldn't get a mention. So what's the point of having the reach if PayPal didn't get a mention? Although occasionally a brand might take a lead on trying to get a subject. They're not so bothered about the brand as long as there's a discussion about whatever they're interested in. So, you know, if it was something on, I don't know, ATMs, if it was a bank and all they wanted to hear was ATMs, then Sky would be okay. But if you wanted to hear Santander or NatWest or whatever, then you're not going to get that. So it's happiness for one client or brand can be quite different to the next one, and that's where it gets tricky. But that's why I think it's quite important to try to explain what the landscape is now, because it's really divided into those three things, and it's about managing expectations, isn't it? Because you can't have somebody saying, oh well, we want to be on global and it's corporate spokesperson. It's just not going to happen. So I'm trying to sort of tell you warts and all that these are the problems and these are the advantages, and so that you know where it stands when it comes to speaking to clients or colleagues to explain where we are. Slightly going off piece now. I'm going to go back to I'm going to hide behind my PowerPoint again. Oh, now I've lost you all on it. Hold on. Yeah, so there we are with commercial radio. And if you felt that I didn't explain it fully, John is, to be honest, better at explaining the commercial sector than me. Then we can have questions at the end and we can go through it again. I wanted to show you though how we think the logistics for the whole thing is going to change. So the studio that's our old studio in Bloomsbury. So probably, Joe, the last time I spoke to you, we were in Covent Garden, but we had 4 years in Bloomsbury with that studio, and you can see the producer and the sound desk, and then behind that window was the sound booth. And then on the other picture with the desk and the laptops, and I think that is Jono on the screen there, that's how we're working now. And so with the red laptop, that's recording the audio. Jono would have been on producing the radio day and on a Zoom, which means anybody can listen in on the Zoom, so you can hear the interviews as they go out. We still record it, we still do a podcast, we still give you the clips and the reach at the end of it. As I say, the coverage is really back to how it was, but that's how we're doing it. And moving forward, we've actually decided, I mean, call this luck or good timing, but our lease in Bloomsbury came to an end 31st of December, just a few weeks ago, and we've decided not to renew it. And what we will be doing once COVID restrictions lift is we will be offering a pop-up radio studio. So it'll look a little bit like Jono's desk there, but it will be portable. We'll be bringing with us microphones on stands. It's like it looks like egg boxes, but it's a sort of a sound wall. So wherever we are, whether it's somebody's office or we've gone to somebody's home, it doesn't really, it could be anywhere really with an internet connection, that we would always be able to create quality sound by bringing the studio with us. So it's much more flexible, and if you work for an agency, it does mean that potentially the pop-up studio could be at your agency, so it looks much more part of your offering rather than something you've outsourced. If you've got a celebrity who's being quite mean with their time, that it means that you could get more out of them that way, that instead of spending time travelling into London, they can be somewhere that's more local to them so that you get more airtime. We can go to someone's office, it makes it more convenient, you save time. You know, I think there's a lot of advantages to it. And with broadcasters saying that they're happy with the remote interviews and wanting to continue it, we think the best thing to do is to evolve and move with the broadcasters. So that's what we're planning to do. No doubt our competitors with long leases will tell you otherwise, but part of the reason as well why we're so willing to go with this is it's not just because the broadcasters have said that. The broadcasters like us have been forced by BT, who provide ISDN lines. They're the only supplier of ISDN lines. So this was quality sound, a bit like a telephone line, but better than a telephone line because it was broadcast quality. And they were taking those away. They've been trying to do it for a number of years, but they're no longer taking orders for new ISDN lines. And they were intending making them obsolete in the next couple of years. And instead, they were expecting broadcasters and anybody wanting broadcast quality to use VoIP instead. So I think what it's done is something that was going to happen probably 2 years down the line actually has just happened quicker. This is a throwback too. So when I first went into PR, this was a thing, giveaways. So different from sponsorship or adverts, this was giving prizes away. And when we first set up Shout, which was about 18 years ago, this was a really big thing. And we were always coming up with ideas. It was always things like a goodie bag for a night in. And it would be a bottle of wine, some DVDs, a tray to have a telly dinner on. It'd be that sort of thing. And back then it was about, they wanted stuff that was worth about £50. If the prize got too big, then it became an advert, and so there was conflict with the sales department in the commercial stations. And even BBC did these giveaways too, but they had to keep the price down because they couldn't be compromising the rules of their license. So this went away, and it was, I think some of you too young to remember, but it was a scandal to do with people calling in for competitions to win prizes, but there was a premium numbers, so it cost money. And there was a broadcaster, a national broadcaster, it might have been someone like GMTV actually, now GMB, that was taking calls even after they'd closed the competition. So it was a bit of a scandal, and then they all seemed to go away. And now they're back. So for the tricky client, the really commercial one where you're thinking, they want a radio day, and I don't know how we can come up with a story that's going to be palatable for even the smallest station. It's a possible thing now. So we would write the cue. It gets agreed with the client and the station before it goes out. It's guaranteed branding. You have to come up with this prize. We charge a similar fee. per placement, and it's lovely. There it is. If it goes to a larger commercial station, that's when they'll want a fee for doing it, and you know, you can talk tens and sometimes hundreds of thousands of pounds for the bigger stations. But this sort of cheap and cheerful giveaway, I'm kind of bemused that it's come back, but it is, so you know about it and it's there. National radio, happy news, I think, in national radio. You might be aware that Times Radio, so associated with Times newspapers, that began broadcasting last year. We've had some really nice success on that. To begin with, they were talking the talk and sounding like they would be too newsy and too above taking PR stories, but they don't. And John Pienaar, if you remember, I think he was deputy political editor at the BBC. He was talking to a Pussycat girl for one of our campaigns. And we think it's good. We think Times Radio is a good opportunity, quite confrontational, not quite an LBC, but newsy, and with enough variety in the programmes that even softer PR stories could be placed. I particularly like a slot which is on it's on a Friday. It's called Happy Hour, and it is talking about happiness. The other week they had Alistair Campbell, who was talking about his depression, but it was about how it then made him happy again, or how he made himself happy. So worth a listen, and we think definitely worth a placement. They've got some really good names with their presenters. Nobody really knows what the audience figures are like, but positive feedback, and I think a good opportunity. LBC remains quite tricky to get on. Talk radio, we get a lot with that. Sometimes Talk Sport, so you can do a newsy story if there's some sort of sporting angle, perhaps a brand ambassador. And jazz, we like, for business clients, we do like a little bit of jazz in the morning. Jazz says it's taken some listeners from Wake Up to Money on Radio 5 Live. So it's people that are going to dip in, dip out of a broadcaster in the morning on their way to work or on their way to their bedroom study. Sky News I've already talked about, but we think on the BBC, on Radio 4, Today programme, not for every client and every story. It's quite news setting. When I was a journalist, we used to, I think particularly when I worked at ITN and was news editing, you had to be sitting in your desk at a minute before 6 in the morning to start your shift in order to have the Today programme headlines on, because whatever the headlines were, that was going to be the main stories for the lunchtime news, and you know, that's the basis for news for the rest of the day, and then newspapers follow the next day. But you know, You and Yours, for somebody like you, Joe, I would have thought You and Yours was a pretty good one. And Woman's Hour, for those tricky subjects that they don't shy away from, we've had success there too. 5 Live, I would say more breakfast, and then sometimes businessy type stories in the drive time, and then pretty serious stories, I would say 4 PM, which is on Radio 4, and World at 1 on Radio 4 too. And not to forget BBC World. I think with the radio, so BBC World's got radio and TV, but particularly with their business, because they have a business unit there, so that goes across quite a lot of slots, and obviously goes out to a lot of countries too. And so I would say, you know, it's about having really good content to get coverage on national stations. And if it's the sort of story where you need a case study, you know, I know they're hard to find case studies, but if you're lucky enough to get more than one national interview, it's really good if you can offer them each their own case study rather than one case study going across several broadcasters. So national telly, so this is well, this is what most of our clients want, and it's the most difficult thing to get. So in this last year, national TV has really become about analysing the news and explaining what the headlines mean. So it's so quick, isn't it? We turn to an app and we just get a few, or Twitter or whatever, just to get a few lines of a story. But particularly when it's a complex story, a Brexit or a COVID or whatever, national TV news has sort of changed the way it does news. So actually, how a story's covered has become longer. So instead of just a minute and a half, stories might now have a reporter talking, they might have an interviewee, or they might have a package and then go back to the reporter. There's a lot of reporters being socially distanced, but in the studio too. And it's because they feel that national TV can't compete with quick news, because logistically it takes too long. And so national TV is now starting to try to offer a different interpretation, really, so that the media is then different from social media. Very difficult to get national TV, but earlier in the day is going to be better. The good news is that there are 2 news stations about to happen. One's News UK, so this is the Murdoch station, and the other one is called GB News, and that's got Andrew Neil, the broadcaster and used to be the Times editor. He's something like the chairman, but he's part of the money behind it as well. So they've both those stations have been given the go-ahead, meaning they've got a license from Ofcom, and they're both supposed to be starting early 2021. So hopefully soon. I think the GB News, I think it's going to be more political, and the talk is that both of them are going to be more right-wing. So this is quite unusual for broadcast, because whilst you can say Guardian might be more left and a Telegraph more right-wing, broadcasters have always pitched themselves as being neutral. I know accusations go about BBC being lefty, but on the whole they try to say that they're apolitical. So for 2 stations to come out and say, that they have any political leaning is going to be quite different, really, for the broadcast landscape, and something that we've not seen before. So I always think BBC One, it's quite, when you think about how television news evolves through the day, BBC One is the best example, because it has very early and very, very late bulletins. And when you look at BBC Breakfast, and this is where I think the best chance for coverage on BBC One comes, you've got BBC Breakfast, which is a 3-hour-long programme, but actually it's divided into really 20-minute sections, and it gets repeated. Those 20-minute sections sometimes don't change at all, sometimes change a little bit, covering news and business, sport, and then a little bit of weather too. Why we've got the best chances is that it's mainly diary stories that have been arranged the day before, unless something's happened during the night. But it's obviously more logistically difficult to set things up. It's not impossible, but unless it was a massive accident or a massive incident, they're unlikely to set up interviews, at 3 o'clock in the morning. So that's the best chance. So it's a small opportunity, but it is the best chance. Whereas by the time it gets to lunchtime news, some of the stories from BBC Breakfast will still be there, but news stories come in too. And they do tend to reflect what was the traditional stay-at-home audience. Of course, that's been blown out over the last year, but the news hasn't really evolved that much. It's still thinking that it's going to be older people, perhaps who've retired, or parents or carers that are at home with small children. And so what they try to do is to reflect the audience with the news, because that's going to be more interesting for them. And it's why you get more health and family orientated stories in that lunchtime news. So the 6 o'clock news always used to be aimed at people that had been out to work early and had come back early and were sitting down having their tea in order to watch the 6 o'clock news. So largely they've said it's a C2DE audience. If it was a newspaper, it probably would be the Express or the Mail. It's a summing up of the day's stories quite quickly with less analysis than you would probably get later in the day when you've got the flagship programme, the 10 o'clock news. Now, it's so competitive for this, I can count in 20 years of doing PR, probably on one hand, how many times we've got, maybe two hands, how many times we've ever got the 10 o'clock news. And that's because you've only got half an hour. And in that time, they're having 3 stories, which these days could be the package and the reporter live. They nearly always do a business story, really justifying the business unit that is so well staffed now. 1 politics, 1 foreign, which again is justifying having crews and journalists abroad, and then maybe a lighter or an and finally type story. So trying to squeeze a PR story into that is really, really difficult. So if you're going to embargo a story a minute past midnight, that goes for radio and TV, so that people can run it in the breakfast shows. If it's something that where journalists would want to do their own interviews, or there's an opportunity in better times to film something, 9 o'clock in the morning, that's the time that you should allow them in to film. So the day crew started, they're not going to send a overnight early morning crew out on a PR story, highly unlikely. But any later, then are they going to make the lunchtime news? Probably not. So 9 o'clock is the optimum time for that one. Other places where we certainly get TV opportunities, GMB on ITV, which is it's more female audience. When it covers big stories such as COVID, it's always wanting the personal stories. So it's always about case studies. They love a celebrity. So that's really for PR the key to success there. Sky News a bit more accommodating, I would say, partly because their pure news goes on for longer than the news hour that you get with GMB. Sometimes with Channel 5, but not so much. They like sort of lighter, more tabloidy type stories. If they were a newspaper, they'd probably be the Mirror. ITN, that despite its commerciality, probably more similar to BBC One in terms of the national news. And then we very rarely get Newsnight or Channel 4, which is really a reflection of the clients that we get. Sometimes with some techie clients, Newsnight, Channel 4, it got its license by saying it was an alternative to other broadcasters, so it always has a different agenda. And I think if you compared, say, News at 10 on ITN and BBC One, the top 3 stories, they're nearly always going to be the same. But those 3 stories would probably be the stories that would just be in the news belt for Channel 4 News, because Channel 4 News will always try to make its top story something different, a bit more investigative. And so it's difficult to tap into PR, I think, with that one. But if your client or you are set on national TV, these days it's having excellent spokespeople and willing and available. That's the bird that gets the worm. People that will jump on a Zoom at the moment and will get up early to do 6:15 for BBC Breakfast are the ones that are going to be favoured and invited back again. You've got to be confident for telly, haven't you, really? Because even when you're doing it in your bedroom or whatever remotely, it's a daunting thing. And broadcasters are still really looking for opinion. They like to pit people against each other to have that contrasting views, which makes for more engaging and entertaining television at the end of the day. How things have changed is, I think over the years, certainly the time I've been doing PR, is that it used to be unusual to be media trained as a spokesperson, and now I think broadcasters really expect it. They expect that polished performance for people not to be phased, to be able to do whatever a broadcaster asks them at the time, and capable of doing live interviews, because that's really the majority of the interviews at the moment, and moving forward, are live interviews, because that's cheap telly, it's quick, it's the easy, chop it in, chop it out. That's really the way forward. And then to think pictures, because this is really difficult at the moment, because how can you offer pictures when really nobody's supposed to be going out? And you think, oh, well, of course TV crews are going to go out, but actually they're only going to go out reluctantly. Apparently there was great reluctance to get coverage for Brexit over Christmas from broadcasters. They were trying to get their own crews to go out there, and they were having big problems, and it was because people didn't want to have to self-isolate when they came back, and people were just concerned for their own safety, and just didn't want to go. So you think, so how's that going to work for filming? And I do think it's difficult at the moment. And so the other option is B-roll. And so we've been making B-roll for forever. B-roll to us is now 6 to 8 minutes of roughly edited footage that's given to broadcasters free of charge and any copyright issues. Partly now because they can't go out and film their own stuff. So it's got to be shot in a new style. Broadcasters, they say they won't use B-roll, but they do use B-roll, because they're short of resources, and now, you know, they're encumbered by restrictions too. But it can't look like an advert. It's got to look like something they'd have shot themselves. Or Joe, for you, if you've got people on the ground in a situation and you had footage, they would take something like that too, but they would label that as your footage, whereas B-roll footage would get mixed in with their own footage, and it will be passed off as something that they've shot themselves. As long as the story's good and it's visual. What would be difficult would be something like I suppose a PayPal type client, where you think, well, what are you going to film? And it's always, you've got to be able to film something that broadcasters couldn't easily film for themselves. So they could film somebody using PayPal on a laptop, but what else could they see that they couldn't easily access ordinarily? Broadcasters that speak at the events that we run, so it's mainly small talks we're doing on Zoom at the moment, but we used to have some bigger events too. They always say, oh, we want to do our own interviews, don't put interviews on a B-roll. But we would say you should, and it's for all the reasons that I've got there. It's a good test really for the spokesperson, and sometimes that corporate spokesperson, the CEO, is saying, oh, well, I want to do an interview, and you think, oh, you're never going to get on air, but actually we could put you in the B-roll. And it's a good way as well for testing out key messages. A B-roll is going to be something that's hopefully going to be hanging around and used for quite a while. So those key messages need to be sorted out, and you know they're going to be it's B-roll, so it's going to be approved. So it's a good test for them. And then finally, it sometimes showcases the spokesperson to the broadcaster. So if somebody's done a good clip, which of course they will, because we keep on filming it until they did something lovely, that the broadcaster might think, oh, actually that was really good. I'm gonna book them in for my own interview. But we would say put the good pictures at the start of the B-roll and the interview clips at the end. So currently Zoom or Skype, they will eventually go on location. And so a spokesperson could be on location speaking to studio presenters, or they might send a presenter on location for either a live or a pre-recorded interview. So when restrictions regarding COVID finally ease, that's likely to happen. But it's going to be some time before, because of COVID, before people are going back to sofa interviews. So it's about being good really by doing remote interviews. So, thinking about the background, I knew I was going to say that, and I was thinking, oh, my own background's really terrible. So I've cleared cleared a load of files and found a few things that I've shoved up on the shelf, and it's still looking awful. So don't do my background. But it's thinking about, you're doing an interview from home, so it doesn't need to look like an office, but you don't want anything that's going to compromise you in the background either. Yeah, it should be eye level. So I've not done a very, I look much better like that, hopefully, because if my camera is sort of level with my nose, so it's slightly looking up at me, it is better if the camera can be at eye level with you. It's just a slightly more flattering shot, basically. We would always say, and with our clients, have a technical rehearsal the day before to make sure that everybody is au fait with what they're doing. And also to think about what the microphone might be like. So you might need another microphone because some laptop mics aren't particularly good. And in fact, we generally think that phone mics are better than laptop mics. So if there was a problem and you didn't have an additional microphone, maybe consider doing an interview on a phone. You know, shut the door and try to be quiet. We all remember that, wasn't he, a professor and his kids came into a live interview. A broadcast interview won't last for very long, a few minutes, so you're just trying to be a bit quiet, really. And you know, working from home means what do we wear now? So I would say, you know, when the client was suited and booted, you probably wouldn't be anymore, because we're working from home, and it just needs to be appropriate, really. So we always say, you know, and this is what we do in media training, say, think of the brand. What is the sort of image that you're trying to represent? And it would just look odd, wouldn't it, to be overdressed, I think, these days. So the world has gone full circle, really. So I said I'd mention regional TV a bit. On the plus side, cutbacks and stations that have merged together mean that one regional TV is actually a big chunk of a country these days. So the audience figures when you get regional TV can be good, but the emphasis really is on being regional. So it does take a lot of work in terms of having to get multiple spokespeople quite often, and case studies and filming or pictures from particular regions. You can't pass off a national story and make it regional. They won't go for that. So it is a good opportunity, but it's hard won, and not many clients are that enthusiastic for it, in our experience. So this is my negative slide, really, because we found over the last couple of years that what we used to do for online video, which was really a package that was placed on a newspaper website, they're not interested in doing that anymore. Most newspaper websites either do their own content, in which case you could consider giving B-roll to a website if you're trying to get them to cover a story. But they're much more likely to just do clips taken from the TV. So Piers Morgan, you know, ranting on about something, or possibly a celebrity. Some of them have partnered up with broadcasters anyway. So ITN is partnered, I think it's with the Sun. So you would see clips from ITN on the Sun website. And occasionally they do the sort of citizen videos. So, you know, some big fight over a mask at the Co-op or whatever, something of the moment. But a pre-planned PR generated piece of content, we think, is quite difficult to get placed these days. And I hope you'll forgive me, just one slide before we have a chat and take some questions about how we work. So we primarily offer three things: media relations, production, and media training. With media relations, we either do projects such as a radio day with or without TV. We can do a mix of national radio and TV. We always try to be flexible and do what you want, and within reason can work to budgets. We do have some clients that we work with direct, and they tend to be on retainers, and that's when they don't have particular stories themselves, but they would like to use Hijack typically. So we would find stories that they could comment on in the news. So our production, so we in the first instance are still doing podcasts remotely. We will be offering them in our pop-up studio, same as a radio day, and we can offer we have partner studios as well. So I think podcast post-COVID can go back into a studio. And then the video production, B-rolls, social, more for social media, and corporates when it's a glossy thing. Media training, we've successfully done that remotely, and it's good training, isn't it, to be able to do it for Skype and Zoom. We will eventually offer it on location too. And that's it. So I'm going to stop screen sharing. I hope that made sense.